And here's my answer to question 1b, which is, compare how your chosen films reflect their different production contexts. And here's my answer. Both Some Like It Hot and Do the Right Thing reflect very different production contexts. Some Like It Hot was made under the studio system, which meant it reflects the mainstream middle-of-the-road tastes of a wide audience. Because the studio system was all about making as much money from their product as possible, so they needed to appeal to the taste of as many people as possible in order to attract the widest possible audience to see their films, thus making tons of money through ticket sales. And if the film was particularly good, more tickets would be sold through repeat viewings and word of mouth amongst those who had already seen it, especially important before the advent of videos and DVDs in the home. More than anything, the studio system was about film as a business first and a form of art second. The big studios such as Warner Bros., Paramount and United Artists, the latter of which made Some Like It Hot, had control of the film industry since making films was expensive, and they also owned all the cinemas that showed films too. In other words, they had the monopoly on the film business, hook, line and sinker. However, during the 60s and 70s, the studios were becoming out of touch with the tastes of the all-important youth market. At the same time, young filmmakers were coming out of film schools and itching to make their mark in the films industry. These young filmmakers were looked down upon by the old school studio system and essentially blackballed from getting work in the studios because the studios thought they knew everything. Nonetheless, these filmmakers were passionate about film and wanted to tell a story. Crucially, film equipment was easier to access for these young filmmakers, who would often either borrow or hire cameras and editing equipment from the same universities they studied at. They made independent films, i.e. films financed, made and shown in cinemas without the help of the studios, with stories accessible to the young because they too were young. So suddenly, films that only cost a couple of thousand to make were making millions at the box office, because there was an audience crying out for something different compared to what the studios were offering at the time. The most famous landmark film that reflected this change was Easy Rider in 1969. It cost $360,000 to make, yet made $60 million at the box office. 20 years later, Spike Lee would come out of film school, make films and box office smashes, and set the tone for the new era of filmmaking proper. But let's look at each film individually in detail and consider the deeper production context of each film, which are very different to one another. Some Like It Hot is a 1959 American romantic comedy film set in 1929, directed and produced by Billy Wilder, starring Marilyn Monroe, Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. The film was produced in black and white, even though colour films were increasing in popularity. But according to Wilder, he tried colour, but both Curtis and Lemmon looked unacceptably grotesque, his words, in colour. This is important because since most studio movies use gimmicks as an attention grabber for the audience, this film showed that quality of storytelling was more important in the long run. The film was made by United Artists, which although it originally set out to give actors more freedom, was nonetheless bound by the rules set out by the studio system. This meant they still had to follow typical filmmaking conventions, i.e. recognisable actors playing recognisable character types, all bound up in what is known as the classical Hollywood narrative. The classical Hollywood narrative was ridiculously simple. A very stereotypical male hero or heroes faces seemingly insurmountable odds, but in the end saves the day and more often than not gets the girl and lives happy ever after. The films had clear heroes and clear villains, and crucially audiences didn't have to think too hard in order to enjoy them. Some Like It Hot follows this old school production context to the letter, but remains part of film history because it is thoroughly entertaining and fantastically written. Still considered one of the funniest comedies of all time. Indeed, the men pretending to be women in order to avoid villains plot has been used again and again since, which only proves the film's historical importance. At the time though, the film was quite controversial because of the cross-dressing theme. So much so in fact that the film had to be made without the approval of the Hays Code. The Hays Code was the set of industry moral guidelines that was applied to most United States motion pictures released by major studios from 1930 to 1968, named after Will H. Hays, who was the president of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, the MPPDA. In effect, it was film censorship in a country that was usually guaranteed free speech under the US Constitution, but, nonetheless, was born of controversies that threatened the film industry. Most notably, silent movie star Fatty Arbuckle's botched abortion of Virginia Rappe in 1921. By the time Some Like It Hot was made, however, the code didn't have as much sway over the film industry as it once did. So Some Like It Hot could get away with not having the seal of approval from the Hays Code, whereas in times prior it would have been mandatory. The code has been gradually weakened in its scope during the early 1950s due to the increasing tolerance for previously taboo topics in film, but it was still officially enforced. However, the overwhelming success of Some Like It Hot is considered one of the final nails in the coffin for the Hays Code. So the sexual innuendo that featured in Some Like It Hot was a direct result of the gradual loosening of film censorship in America. By contrast, Do the Right Thing was made when film censorship in America had crashed in the late 60s and was made advisory. A film could be released unrated and not go through the MPAA, whom replaced the MPPDA, but could lose out on revenue from cinemas and video stores whom refused to show and stock unrated films. Do the Right Thing received an R rating from the MPAA, which meant under 17s had to be accompanied by a parent or guardian. This was a far cry from the system in which Some Like It Hot operated in, especially given Do the Right Thing's overt sexual references and language, as opposed to the problems of profanity-free yet sexually implicit films such as Some Like It Hot's era of filmmaking. More importantly, independent cinema had established itself as a commercially viable form of filmmaking, although the studios had more sway over the industry and unfortunately still do. This meant that a film like Do the Right Thing came along at the right time, especially as there weren't many films that, like Do the Right Thing, represented the black experience in America. This was probably why it was so successful, in that it spoke to a sizable yet criminally ignored section of the public, black people. It also helped that it was made in liberal times and that a lot of white people enjoyed the film too. The film was a trenchant exploration of the racial politics of New York City at the time, from provocative trash talking to police violence and an ensuing riot, even extending to the graffiti on the wall reading "Tawana told the truth." Tawana Brawley became a political flashpoint in 1987 when, as a teenager, she was found in a trash bag smeared with feces and with racial slurs written on her body. She said that 6 white men had raped her, although a special state grand jury the following year declared that she had fabricated the story. Lee chose to set the film on a hot summer's day because, according to Lee, when the heat goes up in New York City, so does the murder rate and street violence. This type of film is a million miles away from a film like Some Like It Hot, because when Some Like It Hot was made, overt representations of American politics was avoided due to 2 major factors. One was that black people still didn't have equal rights, let alone the chance to make a film about their experiences, nor even be seen in movies, unless in a subservient role. And the other was simply that Hollywood generally believed, and still does to this day, that people wanted to go to see movies to be entertained and escape reality, not to be taught and confronted with the harsh realities of society, i.e. didactic movies which aim to enlighten the audience, which essentially Do the Right Thing does. Unlike Some Like It Hot, Do the Right Thing offers no happy ending, which crucially it would have had to have had Do the Right Thing been made within the studio system. Indeed, it would probably never have been greenlit in the first place within the studio system. Lee could make whatever film he wanted because the studios weren't involved in any way, and he did just that. Lee ends the film ambiguously. The police kill yet another innocent black man, Radio Raheem, yet it is clear they will face no consequence. The rioting that the killing caused destroyed the neighbourhood, and it is unclear what the future has in store for the characters whom were affected by the movie's events. More than anything, Lee made a polemical film, a film that deliberately raises more questions than it answers, and that is the complete opposite of what a film like Some Like It Hot was allowed to do back in the studio era. In conclusion, both films were made within contrasting political contexts. Some Like It Hot was made in a far more conservative time in American history, where honest depictions of American life were frowned upon and rarely ever greenlit. Do the Right Thing, by contrast, was made long after the civil rights struggle of the 1960s, so African Americans were freer to express themselves, even if somewhat paradoxically it was to express how even in modern America they were still being oppressed. And that got the full 40 marks.